I just wanted to post, first of all, an excerpt from Vladimir Putin's speech dated from the 21st of February this year, days prior to the invasion of Ukraine, which reveals in so many ways his view of what Ukraine is. And in his mind, it is not an independent state or an independent sovereign nation. He described modern Ukraine as entirely created by Russia, more precisely Bolshevik Communist Russia, and this process began immediately after the revolution of 1917. As a result of Bolshevik policy, Soviet Ukraine arose, which even today can, with good reason, be called Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's Ukraine. He is its author and architect. This is fully confirmed by archive documents, and that's what Putin claims. Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood, and from the very first steps, they began to build their statehood on the denial of everything that unites us. They tried to distort the consciousness, the historical memory of millions of people, entire generations living in Ukraine. Days before launching his invasion of Europe, Putin dismissed the idea that Ukraine was a sovereign state and a nation, a people separate and distinct from Russia. Putin's views of Ukraine reflect a long-standing Russian perspective that saw the Ukrainian people as fellow Slavs, united under the Russian imperial banner. Imperialist Russian historians of the 19th century, such as Vasily Klyuchevsky, argued that the beginnings of the Russian state were in Kiev, or Kiev, as they call it, and labeled the land surrounding the city as Kievan Rus. As Klyuchevsky wrote, from Kiev it was, and not from Novgorod, which is located further eastward, that the political federation of Russian Slavdom originated. The people living in the borderland regions between Russia and the lands west that comprise the historic Ukraine would beg to differ. Ukrainian identity, like all identities, are complicated. While having some connection to Russia through Slavic linguistic ties and Orthodox Christianity, Ukrainian identity is also distinct. Defining what Ukrainian identity is comparable to defining what any other national identity is. And that's a complicated concept. When we think of identity, we often think of ethnicities, but ethnicities are adopted characteristics. They are constructed characteristics, or what Benedict Anderson called imagined communities, that are based on language, religion, culture, and having a shared historical memory or mythology. These characteristics are also malleable and ever-evolving. Characteristics are also complicated by history, the movement of peoples over distances and times, and of course facts which do not succumb to the whims of tyrants and frauds. The history of Ukraine is complicated by the fact that much of the modern frontier of Ukraine has been fought over between the Russian princes and later between the Russians and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Commonwealth had come to dominate those lands through the support of the local nobility, who called themselves as the people of the frontier region, or Ukrainian, and then converted to Western Christianity in 1569 from Orthodox Christianity. However, many of the peasants and other nobles remained Orthodox Christian, and by 1596, despite efforts by Jesuit missionaries, many peasants still resisted conversion to the Roman Rite until a conclave struck a deal at the Union of Brest that created the Greek Catholic Rite. With this agreement, the Orthodox Patriarch of Kiev agreed to accept the leadership of the Pope and professed ecclesiastical loyalty to the Roman Church in return for a continuation of Orthodox practices and liturgy and allowance for married priests. And that kind of relationship still continues to this day. The Greek Catholic Rite became dominant in the lands west of Kiev, while Orthodox Christianity was foremost eastward. Intermixed were among the different Christians were also Jews and Muslims who resided along the Black Sea coastline. This is one aspect of Ukrainian identity, religion. Yet it is a religious identity consisting of two Christianities that are divided along, well, at least at that point in time, divided the ruling elite and the peasants, but also continues to divide Ukraine today. That sense of identity, along with linguistic identity, language being another source of identity. We have the creation of a literary Ukrainian language, which was the work of an emancipated serf, a painter, and a poet, Taras Shevchenko. His poetry described the epic struggles of the Ruthenian people to free themselves from Polish and Russian rule, and the literary basis of his poetry was the Ruthenian dialect that he gave greater form to with his poetry and his song. By the late 19th century, Ukrainian dictionaries emerged that incorporated the Cyrillic alphabet, and by the 1890s, we start to see Ukrainian histories. One thing that's absent at this point is a concept of Ukrainian statehood. And that really doesn't begin to emerge until the 20th century, in the post-World War I period, where you have the communists, the Bolsheviks in Russia, claiming that they represent the Ukrainian people, whereas you have Westerners, the Poles primarily, who also seek to organize Ukraine as a bulwark against the spread of Bolshevism and communism. By the start of the Second World War, of course, the Soviets come to dominate that region of Eastern Europe. And as a result, we have Ukrainian identity subsumed under communism or communist class identity.
All right, so I've got what I hope is a fairly brief PowerPoint, but observations on the war. So I've tried to come at this from various angles. And some of it is through the use of aphorisms, and I'll show a few of those on the screen. And at the end, I'll actually offer a range of possible outcomes of the war. Not an exhaustive list, but certainly that's a question in a lot of people's minds. How is this war going to end? And to whose advantage? Obviously, knowing that everybody's already lost tremendously that's been involved in this. So it's certainly worth noting a big war in a big country. Ukraine is the second biggest country in Europe. It's a very large country. Larger than France. It's more than 3 times the size of New England. And if one were to travel in a straight line, pretty much west to east, from Lviv to Luhansk, it's about 700 miles. That's about the drive from Hartford, Connecticut to Indianapolis, Indiana. So it's a large country. And this is the largest war in Europe since 1945. We've got hundreds of thousands of military personnel between the two countries involved in this conflict. So this is no small matter. This is very large, and this is very unusual, certainly, post-World War II. Certainly, the Russian plan was poorly conceived and based on all sorts of information that turned out to be completely false. And the assumptions were essentially, and obviously, once Putin mobilized perhaps 200,000 men at the border, there was no possibility of a strategic surprise. At some point, it was certainly possible that those troops were going to invade. So the Ukrainians knew that, but they could still hope for tactical surprise. The day and the hour they were going to launch the invasion, and where, obviously. Clearly, they also assumed limited resistance because they based this invasion on what happened in 2014 when the Russians went into Crimea and then also intervened in the Donbass region. Crimea down here, the Donbass here. The Crimea, they really occupied without firing a shot. Ukraine was in the middle of a revolution at that moment too, so in no position to resist. There was more resistance in the Donbass, but even that was disjointed. So clearly part of the thinking here was this was going to be a repeat of 2014, that the Russians were going to invade and there would not be much resistance on the part of the Ukrainians. And of course, that was a stunningly bad decision. What also seems clear, what was planned was a coup de main, was to decapitate the government of Ukraine. And the rest would simply be an occupation force rolling in and seizing the key points in the country. On the first day of the invasion, the Russian airborne forces seized an airport called Antonov Airfield. It's about 16 miles from the center of Kyiv. And clearly the plan was to seize this airfield, fly in additional troops and actually vehicles, and then storm Kyiv. And we also know that Kyiv had already been infiltrated by probably Russian special forces. I read over the weekend President Zelensky talking about his bodyguard actually having to fend off the first day and night an attack by these special forces who might have been parachuted into the city. They might have also infiltrated via land, maybe weeks earlier for all we know. But clearly the idea was to seize an airhead here and then fly in additional troops, storm into the capital and decapitate the government, kill or capture the leadership and overthrow the government. And that didn't work because the Ukrainians resisted fiercely. They counterattacked. They actually seized this airfield back from the Russians. The Russians counterattacked themselves the following day, took it back. But by that time, the moment was lost. And from this point on, they never really advanced much closer to Kyiv from Antonov. So this was a stunning setback for them because they did not count on Ukrainian resistance being what it was. It was fierce. It seems this is not as clear. There was another attempt to seize an airfield at a place called Vasilkiv. It's about 22 miles from Kyiv. This is the Ukrainian air base. This was 2 days after the invasion, February 26th. Again, Russian paratroopers. Some of them got on the ground. The Ukrainians wiped them out. And according to reports, the Ukrainians might have shot down 2 Russian transport planes. That would have been 200 dead Russian paratroopers. So this might have been yet another attempt to seize an airfield, put reinforcements on the ground and take Kyiv. So this airborne coup de main was a colossal defeat for the Russians. Again, they did not understand the readiness of the Ukrainian forces and their willingness to fight, and it cost them dearly. Of course, from the geopolitical view, another huge miscalculation of Putin was the response of the West, particularly NATO, which would include the United States and Canada, but even beyond NATO, a broad global response punishing Russia for this invasion, and also immediately assisting Ukraine economically, militarily. Keep in mind intelligence. The amount of intelligence that's been given to the Ukrainians is enormous and has been really important in this war. Cyber warfare. My assumption was the Russians would hack into the Ukrainian governmental sites, military sites, the power grid, and take it all down in days. That hasn't happened to this point. And certainly one reason is the Ukrainians' resourcefulness, but another reason is assistance, global assistance. Another response, Finland and Sweden about to join NATO. That's stunning, stunning. And that is all due to Putin's miscalculation. So there's been this vigorous response from the West almost immediately, and it hasn't ended. The question is, will it be decisive in the end? But certainly without this response, it's hard to see how Ukraine would still be in the fight. An aphorism, amateurs study strategy, professionals study logistics. The Russian military has been never good at logistics. What they rely on is mainly blunt force. So we all are familiar with the 40-mile convoy outside of Kyiv, which was stuck for days. Well, there were reasons for that. One, the Russians invaded with 140 to 150,000 men. A large portion would have been coming along that axis. You know, even under the best of circumstances, the professional military is going to find this really hard to do. You're talking thousands and thousands of vehicles on a limited road network. So without practice, without training, it's not going to go badly. But more to the point, the Russian military relies on rail transport more than any other military in Europe. And that dates back to even the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So once the Russians leave Russian territory, they're at a logistical disadvantage to move troops and move supplies. They don't have enough trucks. They also don't commit enough troops to logistics. So there's a term tooth to tail ratio, the tooth being the fighting element of the military, the tail being the support elements. The Russians have always favored putting more men in the front lines with rifles and fewer supporting those men. And it's cost them in many wars, and it's certainly costing them in this war. The Western militaries, the tooth to tail ratio is much more skewed towards tail, actually. We have fewer fighting people and more support troops, but that allows the fighting people to do their jobs much more efficiently and stay in the field. So again, I could go down a whole list of things. Also, the best troops they're not put in logistics, they're put in fighting units in Russia. So they don't have the best people doing this job. Corruption's a huge problem. They don't maintain their equipment. And you put all that together, and the Russians really struggle to put armies in the field, move them about, and keep them supplied. And they're still struggling 2 months into this conflict. I think this is unique to me, or original to me. The Russian army, a ponderous, blunt instrument. That's really what it is. It's large, certainly. So what I just pulled up on the screen is a comparison in certain categories of Russian to Ukrainian military strength, doing it by ratio. So if you look at the regular armies, the Russians have about a 2-to-1 advantage. Now, this is the entire army of both Russia and Ukraine. It's not necessarily just the part that's been committed to Ukraine. And if you look at equipment, the ratios are even more enormously skewed towards the Russians. Tanks, self-propelled artillery, attack helicopters, and down the list. Air Force, same thing. And we won't even talk about Navy. Ukraine essentially has no Navy to speak of in the Black Sea, and the Russians have some significant forces. But on the other hand, this is numbers. These are quantifiable statistics. We're also going to look at the qualitative statistics in them. The Russian military is large, but as Rom's already indicated, in some sense, it's not really a professional military. It's not well trained, generally speaking. It's not well led. It's still stuck in the sort of czarist Soviet idea of a top-down command structure, where really everybody is risk averse. Nobody does anything without a direct order from his supervisor. So it's very hard to win this way. It's an army where about a third of the troops are still conscripts. They're doing their 1-year service. They're not well trained, and God knows in this war, for the most part, they're not motivated to go risk their lives, but they're there. The Russians disproportionately rely on the airborne forces and the Spetsnaz, that would be special forces, for their combat power. These are their better trained troops, but they constitute maybe a sixth of the total. So the rest are not really well trained. But again, what they have is firepower. They have enormous amounts of firepower at their disposal. And that is how they win. And certainly that's how they won some recent conflicts in other places. So I've got 3 photographs here, one from Mariupol, and we've all been following that on the news, that horrific siege and almost a complete destruction of the city. Aleppo, Syria. Keep in mind the Russians intervened in 2015 in the Syrian civil war. And without getting into the details, this is how they seized the city of Aleppo. They destroyed it using air power and artillery. I mean, they systematically destroyed it. And then if we go back to the 1990s, the Russians fought 2 wars against the breakaway Republic of Chechnya, and they did essentially the same thing. This is the capital, Grozny. So this is the tradition of the Russian military. They're not particularly skilled, but they make up for their lack of skill with firepower. They can destroy things, and they're indiscriminate in how they do it, and that is really part of their doctrine. And if it's military targets, fine, but if it's civilians, so be it too. That's part of their method of warfare. It's brutal, but it can work. It certainly can work. But we have to look at the qualitative factors. And there, the Ukrainians really have a significant advantage. Experience. There's been a war in the Donbass region. This is a breakaway region where a group of Ukrainians, Russian-speaking, broke away in 2014, and the Russian military intervened to assist them. So there's been an ongoing war there for 8 years, and the Ukrainians have gained enormous amounts of experience fighting Russians there, which they've used to huge advantage in this war. Training. After 2014, a number of Western militaries went into Ukraine to help train their military, and that really has transformed it to a large extent into a much more effective fighting force. Built on Western lines, which is a more decentralized structure, which is less risk averse, which really delegates authority to non-commissioned officers, for example, and the lower ranks to make decisions. And that's all paid off in this war. Combined arms operations, that's something the Russians have been abysmal at in this war. So essentially that's combining the different elements of the military force as one to make an effective attacking or defense force. So you have infantry, you have armor, you have artillery, you have air power, but you want to use those in concert. They all have to assist each other. And the Russians have been horrible at this. If we look at the upper right-hand corner, that's Bucha, which is northwest of Kyiv. That was a Russian column, systematically destroyed by Ukrainians, mostly with anti-tank weapons. And I've seen much video of this, them destroying all sorts of Russian equipment. And I'm asking myself, where the heck is the Russian infantry? Where are they? Where are their soldiers on the ground? Where's the air power? Where's the artillery to protect these tanks? The Ukrainians actually been much better at that. Morale and motivation, well, certainly they are motivated, the Ukrainians, because their homeland, the motherland, is literally at risk of being invaded and reoccupied by the Russians. And again, Ram's talked about certainly the ideas of patriotism, civic nationalism. That's been a huge motivator. And keep in mind, the Russians, I don't know what is motivating them, unless they believe, the Putin propaganda, and perhaps to some extent. But it seems to me the motivation is an advantage to the Ukrainians. Equipment, to a large extent, initially, particularly the Ukrainians were using Soviet equipment, very similar to the Russian, except older. But obviously, the West has sent enormous amounts of better equipment to level that playing field. And again, we could look at things like intelligence, innovation, improvisation. Ukrainians have been really masterful at using things like drones to much better effect. Why is their Air Force still flying? Well, one reason is before the initial invasion, what they did is they dispersed their Air Force. The secondary fields, they were flying aircraft off actually highways for the time, to not allow the Russians to destroy their aircraft, in a day or two. They've learned Western tactics too, kind of hit and run tactics. So they've been really resourceful and flexible, much more than the Russians. Well, in another life, I earned a geography degree at CCSU. That was my undergraduate degree. So we do have to touch on geography a little, and it does matter a great deal in this conflict. Some military commentators have noted the Russians are road bound, particularly in northern Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. Now, one reason for that is the Rasputitsa, which is Russian for mud season. Now, that's something the Russians should have understood, because actually this impacts large parts of Russia too. During the mud season, they're really kind of two. In the spring, during the thaw, the winter thaw, and then in the fall, typically there's rain. The soils here are such that wheeled vehicles almost cannot move off road. It's almost impossible. And even tracked vehicles are going to struggle to do so. And that's hampered the Russians, and it still is apparently in the Donbass currently. They're really stuck advancing along just a couple of roads, and that's a huge advantage to the Ukrainians in defending. Obviously, there are other physical features and cultural features that are important factors in deciding this conflict too. Urban fighting is enormously difficult and costly, especially for the attacker. The Donbass is more an open region, which in theory might be an advantage to the Russians, really hasn't been yet. Obviously, cultural features such as seaports have played a major role here. One strategy that's clear is the Russians are trying to cut off Ukraine from the sea. 90% of Ukraine's imports and exports go by sea. So if the Russians particularly succeed at capturing Odessa, which is really the last major port the Ukrainians have, that is going to cripple the Ukrainian economy tremendously. Just one last point here, this idea of interior lines and exterior lines. This conceivably is an advantage to the Ukrainians in that initially the Russians advance essentially along three axes: from the north, from Belarus, from the south, from Crimea, and then from the east, from the Donbass. And the Ukrainians were able to move their forces about as needed using what are called interior lines of communication. So as long as they have the freedom of movement, it's relatively short distances they're having to move forces. For the Russians to redeploy, they're operating along exterior lines. It's a much longer distance for them to move forces from axis to axis. So it's actually an advantage to the Ukrainians. The typical way of overcoming interior lines is by simultaneous advances. But again, that's something the Russians really haven't been successful at doing. Just to summarize, and again, I don't have to go over this in detail, but possible outcomes. I'm kind of starting from most favorable to the Russians to least favorable, essentially, this list. So is it still possible the Russians could topple the Zelensky government? I suppose. I don't think they'll be able to decapitate it, but it's possible. They could certainly destroy the Russian economy, break the morale of the Ukrainian people. Maybe through the use of firepower. God forbid, maybe through the use of chemical or biological weapons, they'd try that. Or just destroying infrastructure, which they're now doing actually. Bridges, roads, railroads, that sort of thing. Is it possible if we go down this list that the Ukrainians could drive the Russians off the territory they've taken, or even liberate the Donbass and Crimea? This would be difficult. This, I think, would be beyond their capability. The Ukrainians seem to operate really well at the battalion level, up to perhaps the brigade level, but these would require division-sized forces. And I don't know if they have the capability of doing this unless the Russians collapse. I see the most likely outcome as something in here, where at some point the Russians are not going to be able to advance, and there's going to be some sort of peace brokered, which may allow them to keep, I think it will, at least some of the territory they've taken. But that remains to be seen. Obviously, another wild card is, will this become a wider conflict? Will NATO get more directly involved? And that brings with it all sorts of possibilities, all sorts of threats too. So we'll see, but I think ultimately, this war could just grind to a halt, and there'll be some sort of negotiated settlement that indeed is not going to be a long-term settlement. It's going to set the stages for trouble for years to come for both countries. And I think that's it. Thank you.